Riverside Federal Prison greeted Daniel with a sense of otherworldliness. The whole arrival process seemed surreal to him, as if it were happening not to him, but to someone else whose life he was watching from the outside. The gray concrete, the clanking of metal doors, the orders of the escort sounding like through a layer of absorbent cotton. The clearance procedure seemed endless. Photographs, look straight ahead, don't smile, fingerprints, press harder, medical examinations, cough, bend, stretch. Strip, the guard ordered with an impassive face as Daniel was led into a special inspection room. Completely, take everything off. Daniel slowly took off his clothes, trying to preserve the remnants of his dignity. But it wasn't here. Dignity. There was only a body to be checked for forbidden items, infections, tattoos. Bend over and spread your buttocks. The same impassive voice, the same lack of interest in his feelings. A humiliating body search, after which Daniel felt defiled. A shower with disinfectant that made his skin itchy and red. The issuance of uniforms. Too big, smelling of chlorine and other people's sweat. It was all happening in a fog, like part of a nightmare you can't wake up from. Reyes, follow me. Another guard led him down the long corridor after processing. Their footsteps echoed off the bare walls. Every turn, every grate brought Daniel closer to the new reality where 7 years of his life were to be spent. 7 years. 2,555 days. He tried to comprehend the number, but it seemed unreal, impossible. They passed through several checkpoints, stopping each time for identification. The other prisoners looked at Daniel with curiosity and appraisal. Newcomer, fresh blood. Some called out to him, but the guard ordered him not to stop. Cell 238. The guard stopped in front of a door at the end of C block. Your neighbor Martinez, an old-timer, will show you what's what. Don't cause trouble, and trouble won't find you. The door opened with a metallic clang that made Daniel's teeth clench. Inside sat a stocky, middle-aged Hispanic man with graying temples and a scar across his left cheek. He was reading a tattered paperback book and didn't even look up when the door opened. Welcome to hell, newcomer, he said, turning a page. I hope you don't snore. The door slammed shut behind Daniel's back, with a deafening clang that seemed to sever the last link to his former life. He stood, clutching the items he'd been given. 2 changes of underwear, toiletries, a thin blanket, a pillow, to his chest. I'm Ramon, the cellmate introduced himself, finally lifting his eyes from the book. There was no aggression or curiosity in his gaze, only the tiredness of a man who had seen too much. The top bunk is yours, and stay out of my stuff. Everyone has their own territory here, understand? Got it, Daniel replied, climbing up to the top bunk. The mattress was thin and hard, smelling of chlorine and something else, vague but unpleasant. He lay on his back and stared up at the ceiling, scrawled with the writings and drawings of the previous occupants. Names, dates, curses, crude jokes, a whole chronicle of despair and longing. One thought pulsed in his head. I shouldn't have ended up here. But he was here. And there were 7 years to get used to that thought. The first days in prison had been an endless series of physical and mental challenges for Daniel. Each day began with a 6 a.m. wake-up call to the deafening sound of a siren that made him shudder even in his sleep. This was followed by inspection, breakfast in the mess hall, and assignment to work. The mess hall was a place with its own laws and hierarchy. On the first day, Daniel realized that it was safer to keep a low profile here, but not to look weak. He watched as different groups of inmates took their places. Blacks separate, Hispanics separate, whites separate. There were other groupings, by gang, by term, by crime. Don't sit at that table, Ramon warned him quietly as they stood in line for their trays. That's the Brotherhood table. They don't like loners. Daniel nodded, grateful for the advice. He found a seat in the corner where others like him sat, newcomers who hadn't yet found their place in the prison hierarchy. On the third day, at lunchtime, he was approached by a large prisoner nicknamed Bull. Daniel didn't know his real name, but he'd heard about his reputation, one of the most aggressive prisoners on the block, known for his unpredictability. Hey, pretty boy, Bull called out, hovering over the table like a storm cloud. I hear you're in here for stabbing some guy. Daniel didn't answer, continuing to eat the flavorless oatmeal. He knew people like Bull were looking for a reaction. any weakness to exploit. His silence was a conscious choice, not cowardice. "I'm talking to you." Bull stepped closer, his massive figure casting a shadow across the table. "Are you deaf?" Daniel felt the muscles in his back tense, his body instinctively preparing for battle. He slowly set the spoon aside and looked at Bull, calmly, without challenge, but without fear. "No," Daniel replied calmly. "Just busy." Laughter at the neighboring tables made Bull frown. No one likes to look stupid, especially someone like him, whose authority is built on fear and submission. "You think you're the smartest?" He sharply knocked the tray out from under Daniel's hands, sending the remains of his breakfast to the floor. "It doesn't work that way here." The moment of choice had arrived. The moment that would determine his position in prison for the rest of his sentence. Daniel stood up slowly. He wasn't big, but years of construction work had made him wiry and strong. The key was not to show fear. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said quietly but firmly. His voice didn't shake, though his heart was pounding like crazy. "But I won't run either." The bull swung a quick movement for such a large man, but Daniel had expected it. He ducked and responded with a precise blow to the solar plexus. It was instinct, not calculation, to knock the air out without doing serious damage. The big man bent over, gulping for air. His face was purple with rage and suffocation. Daniel could see the shock in the eyes of the prisoners standing nearby. No one had expected the newcomer to dare fight back against Bull, much less successfully. "You bitch!" Bull wheezed as he regained the ability to speak. His huge hand reached for the shiv hidden in his sleeve. It all happened very quickly. Daniel was ready for another attack, but he didn't have time to react. The guards were already running toward them, grabbing their batons. One of the prisoners shouted, "Cops!" and most backed away, not wanting to get between the conflicting parties and the authorities. "Disperse!" commanded one of the guards, hitting the table with his baton. "Reyes Perkins, face the wall, hands behind your head." Daniel obeyed. He could feel the adrenaline still bubbling in his blood, his hands trembling from the exertion. He was pushed against the wall, his hands behind his back, and handcuffed. Bull received the same treatment, though it took 3 guards for him to get the same treatment. 3 days of shoe, both of you," the older guard announced, "for fighting in the mess hall, and be glad it wasn't worse." They were taken apart. On the way to the SU, Daniel could hear Bull shouting threats, promising to get to him and gut him. Strangely, those threats hardly bothered him at all. He had survived the trial, the loss of his freedom, the humiliation of the processing. What could the rage of one inmate do to him compared to the system that had ruined his life? The Shechu turned out to be a blessing. The small cell with bare walls, stripped of everything but a bunk and a toilet, gave Daniel what he lacked most: solitude. For the first time since his arrest, he could be alone with himself without fear of attack or humiliation. Daniel lay on the hard bunk, listening to the ringing silence, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation and the occasional screams from the other cells. This isolation gave him a chance to finally comprehend everything that had happened. He thought about that fateful evening, about the girl in the blue dress, about the man who had died by his hand. The images flashed before his eyes again and again, vivid, painfully detailed. How easily the bottle had shattered, how easily the sharp edges of the glass had split the flesh, how quickly the life had left the man. It frightened Daniel, not the act itself, but how easy it had been to kill. One movement, a split second, and a life is cut short, and with it, all the lives around him changed. Daniel felt no guilt for the act itself. He was protecting a child from a rapist. It was the right thing to do. It was necessary. But he regretted losing control, letting his anger take over. Maybe there was another way out? Maybe he could have stopped this man without killing him? These questions tormented him, keeping him awake. 7 years, he repeated over and over, looking up at the gray ceiling. 7 years for a moment of anger. 7 years for trying to do what he thought was right. How much of his life would prison take? What will he be when he gets out? In the holding cell, Daniel cried for the first time since his arrest. Not for himself, For that scared little girl who would probably never be able to forget that night. For the murdered man's family who'd lost their father and husband. About her own family. The mother who cried in the courtroom, the sister who couldn't make it, but sent a letter of support. The tears flowed quietly, silently. It was the release he needed to begin to accept the new reality. 3 days in the SHU had changed Daniel. When he was returned to the general cell, Ramon noticed the change. "It's like you've grown up these days," he said, putting the book aside. "That's the way it should be. Prison either breaks you or makes you stronger. I see you're the second type." Daniel didn't answer, but Ramon's words sank into his soul. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo what he'd done. But he could decide how to move on, even within these walls. His status in the prison hierarchy had changed after the SHU. The story of how the newcomer had fought back against the bull had spread throughout the cell blocks. The prisoners had begun to treat him with cautious respect. No one looked for trouble with him, but no one offered him friendship, except for a few prisoners on his block with whom he occasionally exchanged words. Daniel kept to himself, doing his job in the laundry room where he'd been assigned after the SHU. Dirty laundry, industrial-sized washing machines, heat and humidity. It was hard but simple work, requiring no special skills. It fatigued the body, leaving less energy for gloomy thoughts. His free time was spent in the prison library, a place that quickly became his refuge. Among the racks of tattered books, he found temporary relief from the walls and bars. Reading allowed him to travel even while locked up. He devoured books one by one, classic literature, philosophy, history, even detectives. It was there in the library that he first heard of Pastor Parker. "If you need someone to talk to, try Parker," advised the elderly librarian, an inmate named Wilson. He had wrinkled, ink-stained hands and soft eyes behind thick glasses. "He wasn't one of those prudes who only talked about sins. He's a normal guy." Daniel tore himself away from the Count of Monte Cristo, which he was reading for the second time. The story of a man unjustly imprisoned resonated with him. "I don't think I need a priest," he said, turning the page. "I'm not particularly religious. Religion has nothing to do with it." Wilson shrugged, arranging the books on the shelf. "Parker knows how to listen. And in this place, sometimes you just need to be listened to. For someone to see you as a person, not a number or a criminal." The old man's words made Daniel think. Since his arrest, he hadn't felt like a person, only an accused, a defendant, a prisoner. Sometimes it seemed to him that his identity was being erased, dissolving into gray walls and faceless uniforms. "Suit yourself," Wilson added, seeing his doubts. "But he's holding a 10 a.m. chapel service tomorrow. Sometimes it's good to just get out of the routine. Besides, they give out cookies there. Not great, but better than our cafeteria food." Daniel smiled. The prospect of cookies didn't particularly appeal to him, but the idea of getting out of the daily cycle of boredom, work, and isolation was tempting. Besides, something about Wilson's words had stuck with him. The idea that someone might see him as a person, not just a prisoner. Daniel himself didn't understand why he headed to the prison chapel the next day, perhaps out of boredom or curiosity. Or maybe it was the growing sense of loneliness that grew stronger every day inside those walls. The prison chapel was located in a separate wing of the building, a small room with wooden pews and a simple altar. The stained glass window, the only decoration in the place, let in light, tinting it with yellows and blues. When Daniel entered, the chapel was half full. The prisoners sat in groups, talking in low voices. Some seemed genuinely committed to the service, while others had obviously come just for a break in the prison routine. Daniel sat in the last row, ready to leave at the first sign of religious fanaticism or moralizing. He was already regretting his decision to come when he noticed that on the bench next to him was a plate of cookies, the most ordinary store-bought kind, but still a luxury compared to prison food. When Pastor Parker walked in, Daniel was surprised. He had expected to see a stern old man with a Bible, one of those who talk about sin and God's punishment, who see prisoners only as corrupt souls in need of salvation. But in front of them stood a middle-aged man, with shrewd gray eyes and a slight gray on his temples. His face looked tired, but there was a kindness in his eyes that Daniel hadn't seen since entering the prison. "Good afternoon, my friends." The pastor's voice was deep and calm. There was no false cheerfulness or strained enthusiasm, only genuine warmth. "I'm glad to see you all here today, and new faces too." He nodded toward Daniel and a couple of other prisoners, obviously newcomers as well. He didn't start right away with a sermon, as Daniel had expected. Instead, the pastor talked about everyday things, the weather, books he had recently read, news from the outside world. The inmates listened with interest, sometimes asking questions or sharing their thoughts. It was more like a friendly conversation than a church service. "Today I'd like to talk about forgiveness," Pastor Parker said after a short introduction. His voice grew quieter, forcing the prisoners to press forward so they wouldn't miss a word. Not about asking others or God for forgiveness. No, today is about something more complicated, forgiving yourselves. Daniel tensed. It was as if the words were spoken to him personally, as if they touched his deepest thoughts. "Many of us have done the things that brought us here," the pastor continued, looking around the room. His eyes lingered on Daniel for a second, as if he could see his inner struggle. "And regardless of the circumstances, we often punish ourselves more severely than the justice system does, carrying guilt like a heavy stone that keeps us from moving forward." The pastor spoke without pathos, simply and sincerely. Daniel found himself listening without distraction, completely focused on something other than his problems for the first time in days. The pastor's words penetrated deeply, tugging at strings Daniel had forgotten existed. "I'm not asking you to forget your mistakes, or to pretend they never happened." Pastor Parker stepped closer to the front row, as if trying to shorten the distance not only physically, but mentally as well. "But I ask you to consider the possibility of finding peace with yourselves. Because without that, any external forgiveness is meaningless. Without that, we remain imprisoned, even if the walls around us disappear." The service lasted about an hour, but it seemed much shorter to Daniel. When the pastor finished speaking and invited those who wished to approach him for private conversation or prayer, most of the prisoners began to disperse. Some lingered to have a few words with the pastor or to grab an extra cookie. Daniel was in no hurry to leave. He sat looking at the simple crucifix on the wall, trying to sort out his feelings. The pastor's words about forgiving himself had touched something deep inside, something he had tried to ignore or suppress. He didn't notice the pastor approaching him when the chapel was almost empty. "You seem to be new to us," Pastor Parker said with a slight smile. "I haven't seen you here before." Daniel looked up. Up close, he saw that the pastor's face wasn't just tired. There was pain in his eyes, well hidden, but visible to someone who had been through a lot himself. "Yes, recently arrived," Daniel answered with restraint. "A couple weeks ago. Michael Parker." The pastor held out his hand. "Daniel Reyes." He shook it, noting the firm handshake. Not like most priests he'd met, soft and a little squeamish. Parker's handshake was that of a man accustomed to physical labor. "How do you like our little service, Mr. Reyes?" There was genuine interest in the pastor's eyes, without a shadow of the judgment or condescension Daniel was used to seeing in the eyes of those who learned of his crime. "Unusual," Daniel answered honestly. "I was expecting more hellfire and condemnation, more talk of sin and punishment." The pastor laughed openly and easily, not at all the way they laughed in prison. His laughter was neither aggressive nor defensive, just an expression of sincerity. "I'm afraid I've disappointed you. I only have hellfire on my schedule on Thursdays," he winked. "And Tuesdays are a day of humility and meekness. You have to categorize your sins by the day of the week or it all gets mixed up." Daniel smiled involuntarily. It was his first real smile since his arrest. The pastor's humor was unexpected but refreshing. In this bleak place, the ability to joke seemed almost an act of resistance. "If you ever want to talk," the pastor said, already more serious, "my door is always open. Literally, I have an office next to the chapel, and I'm there almost every day. Come by anytime. It doesn't have to be for prayer or confession, just to talk." "Thank you," Daniel replied. And for the first time in a long time, the thank you wasn't just a formality. He was actually grateful for the offer, for this glimmer of humanity in an inhumane place. "You're welcome," the pastor smiled again, and Daniel noticed his eyes lingered on him for a moment, with interest, with some special attention. "I hope to see you again, Mr. Reyes." Daniel nodded and walked out of the chapel, feeling a strange warmth inside. He hadn't planned to return, but there was something about this man that made him trustworthy, that made him want to get to know him better. For the first time in the prison, he had the feeling that there might be something or someone within these walls that could restore his sense of humanity. And that thought gave him a hope that was sorely lacking in this place of gray walls and iron bars. After his first meeting with Pastor Parker, Daniel did not immediately return to the chapel. Something held him back, not mistrust, but rather uncertainty. He had never sought spiritual guidance outside the prison walls, much less friendship with a priest. But Parker's words of self-forgiveness kept him going, coming back again and again in the moments of silence before bed. A week later, on a Thursday, he made up his mind and knocked on the door of the pastor's office. The door was indeed open, just as Parker had promised. Inside was unexpectedly cozy for a prison room. Bookshelves, an old armchair, pictures of some people, presumably family, on the desk. "Mr. Reyes," Parker smiled, taking a break from his book. "It's good to see you. Come in. Have a seat." "Daniel's fine," he said, carefully lowering himself into the chair across from the desk. "Call me Michael, too," he said, setting the book aside and opening the desk drawer, pulling out 2 cups and a thermos. "Coffee? Not the prison stuff, the real thing. A small privilege." Daniel nodded, accepting the offer with surprise. The aroma of fresh coffee hit his nostrils, reminding him of life outside these walls. The first sip was almost painfully pleasant. He'd forgotten how good real coffee could taste. "So, Daniel?" Michael leaned back in his chair. "What brings you here today?" "Your words of forgiveness," Daniel answered honestly. He stopped talking, not knowing how to continue. "Do you want to talk about what brought you here?" the pastor asked gently. "No, I mean yes," Daniel hesitated. "I was protecting a child, a girl, from a rapist, but things went wrong and I killed him. He expected judgment, or at least a detached analysis, but all he saw was understanding in the pastor's eyes. You feel no guilt for the act itself. It was not a question, but a statement. But you do blame yourself for losing control." Daniel looked at the pastor in surprise. How could this man understand in seconds what he was having trouble articulating to himself? "Yes," he answered quietly. "I didn't mean to kill him, just to stop him. Sometimes we're not in control, no matter how hard we try," the pastor said quietly, looking not at Daniel, but through him. "We do what we think is right, but the consequences are not what we expect." Daniel heard something personal in his words, as if the pastor were talking not only about him, but about himself. That first conversation was the beginning of their meetings, first once a week, then more often. They talked about books, about philosophy, about life. Parker turned out to be an excellent listener and interlocutor, educated, but without arrogance, understanding, but not imposing his views. In 2 months of these meetings, Daniel told the pastor more than he had told anyone in his entire life. About his childhood in a poor neighborhood, about the mother who had raised him and his sister alone, about the dreams that had shattered before prison. Michael opened up sometimes too, though more discreetly, about his failed marriage, about his disillusionment with the institutional church, about finding his own path of ministry. "Sometimes I think I get more out of our conversations than you do," the pastor said one day, gazing thoughtfully at the twilight outside the latticed window. "There aren't many people here to really talk to." "People? Not prisoners? Not sinners?" Daniel asked with a slight chuckle. "Just people," Michael smiled, and there was something in his smile that took Daniel's breath away. In these walls, it's so easy to forget that we're all human beings first and foremost, with our fears, our hopes, our weaknesses. Their gazes met and held for a second longer than necessary. Daniel felt something change between them, imperceptibly but irrevocably. The next time they met, unspoken tension already hung in the air. They sat closer than usual, their fingers casually touching as Michael handed him a book, and both pretended not to notice the electric shock running between them. "Why did you choose the prison ministry?" Daniel asked, trying to lighten the atmosphere with casual conversation. Michael hesitated, his gaze distant. "Because the people here are real," he finally answered. "No masks. When you lose everything, all that's left is what's inside. And here I can be real too. Not what they want me to be." "Who do they want you to be?" Daniel asked quietly. "A righteous man. A good family man. A preacher of traditional values." The pastor's voice was bitter. "But masks are exhausting, Daniel. Sooner or later you have to decide whether to live the truth or die in falsehood." "And you chose the truth?" "I try. Every day I try." Their hands were so close on the table that Daniel could feel the warmth of the other man. He didn't remember who made the first movement, him or Michael, but suddenly their fingers intertwined. A simple gesture, innocent from the outside, but full of meaning for both of them. "It's dangerous," Michael whispered, not taking his hand away. "I know," Daniel replied, squeezing his fingers tighter. They didn't do anything more that day, just held hands, talking about insignificant things. But something inevitably changed. Boundaries were crossed. A week later, Michael offered to help Daniel sort through new books for the prison library. The storage room behind the chapel was cramped and dusty, littered with boxes of donated books. "Here." Michael handed him a stack of tattered novels. These went on the fiction shelf. When Daniel took the books, their hands touched again. This time, Michael didn't pull away, but instead held the touch. Daniel looked up and met the pastor's gaze, open, vulnerable, full of unspoken feelings. "I can't stop thinking about you," Michael said quietly, switching to you for the first time. "I know it's wrong, but—" Daniel didn't let him finish putting the books on the nearest box. He stepped forward and kissed the pastor. The kiss was gentle, tentative. Questioning Michael's lips were soft, with a slight coffee flavor. A second of stillness, and the pastor responded, wrapping his arms around Daniel, pulling him closer. Time stopped in that dusty storeroom. The outside world ceased to exist. There was only their touch, their breath, their hearts beating in unison. "We don't have to," Michael whispered, pulling away but not letting Daniel go. "I know," he replied, stroking his cheek. "But I want to. I really do." Michael closed his eyes, as if struggling with himself, then opened them, determined with a kind of inner fire. "Me too," he admitted, and reached for Daniel's lips again. Their second kiss was different, deep, passionate, frenzied. The books fell to the floor as Michael pressed Daniel against the shelving unit. Their hands explored each other, tentatively at first, then more and more boldly. Daniel could feel Michael's heart beating hard under his palm, his breath hot against his neck. The sound of footsteps in the hallway sobered them. They pulled away from each other, breathing heavily. Daniel bent quickly, picking up the fallen books, while Michael smoothed his hair and pulled on his shirt. By the time there was a knock on the door, they looked decent, though slightly agitated. "Pastor Parker?" A security guard peeked through the door. "The director wants to see you. Something about a rehab program." "I'll be right there," Michael replied in a steady voice. When the guard left, he turned to Daniel and said quietly, "We need to be careful. If anyone finds out—" "I understand," Daniel nodded. "But I have no regrets. I don't regret anything." "Neither do I," Michael smiled. "Come to the chapel tomorrow after dinner. Say you want to pray alone. I'll have a block bypass, but I'll be back in half an hour." Daniel nodded, feeling the excitement growing inside, fear mixed with anticipation. This was crazy, a risk for both of them, but for the first time in a long time he felt alive. The next day they met as arranged. The chapel was empty and semi-dark, only 2 candles burning in front of the altar. Daniel waited, trying to calm the trembling in his hands. When the door opened and Michael walked in, all doubt vanished. They didn't speak, words weren't needed. Their lips found each other in the semi-darkness, their hands hurriedly getting rid of their clothes. Skin to skin, breath to breath, they gave themselves to each other completely, without abandon. Michael was gentle and passionate at the same time, his touch making Daniel forget everything. The pastor's body was unexpectedly strong under his strict clothes, with a scar on his shoulder from a long-ago accident. Daniel kissed that scar, feeling Michael flinch at his touch. Their intimacy was at once sacred and sinful, tender and fierce. That night, Daniel had gotten to know the other side of the pastor, the passionate man who had suppressed his true nature for years. Afterward, lying on the pastor's vestments spread out on the floor, they spoke in whispers, their foreheads touching. "I've never felt like this," Michael admitted, stroking Daniel's cheek. "All my life, I thought there was something wrong with me, that I had to change, that I had to become normal." "You are normal," Daniel replied quietly, kissing his fingers. "Just different, just like me." "My marriage was a mistake," Michael continued. "I loved Sarah, but not the way I should have. I tried to conform to expectations. Parents, church, society. I thought things would work out in time, that it was just a trial. And then? Then I realized that I was deceiving not only myself, but her as well. That it wasn't fair to either of us. We divorced 5 years ago. She found happiness with someone else, and I chose to serve here, where I could be away from the judgmental stares. And you found me." Daniel smiled, snuggling against his chest. "Found you," Michael echoed. "And now I don't know if it's a curse or a blessing." After that night, they met regularly, in the chapel after lights out, in the storeroom, sometimes even in Michael's office, with the door locked and the blinds drawn. They learned to be careful, to come at different times, not to show much intimacy in public, to talk about religion and books if anyone could hear. But in private, they gave themselves over to a passion that grew stronger each time. Daniel had never thought he could have such feelings for a man, but with Michael, everything felt right, natural, as if it was meant to be. Michael was gradually opening up to him, not just physically, but mentally as well. He told about his childhood in a religious family, about his inner struggle with his own desires, about how he tried to heal through prayer and marriage. "I thought I hated myself," he said, lying in Daniel's arms after another meeting. "But you helped me realize that I was just afraid. Afraid to be myself. Afraid of being judged. Afraid that God would turn away from me." "So what do you think now?" Daniel asked, kissing him on the temple. "That love can't be a sin," Michael answered quietly. "That God is bigger than the books say, and that I feel whole for the first time in my life." Their secret meetings were Daniel's escape from the prison routine and despair. With Michael, he could be himself, not prisoner number 408, but just Daniel, a man with feelings, desires, dreams. They began to make plans for the future, vague, uncertain, but hopeful. Michael talked about a small lake house where they could live after Daniel's release, about a simple life away from judgmental stares, evenings by the fireplace and sunrises together. "I could get a job at some independent church," he dreamed, "or leave the church altogether, go into counseling or teaching. And I could take a design course," Daniel said. "I've always wanted to work with interiors, creating beautiful spaces for people." They both knew that those plans could only remain dreams, but the very possibility of a future together was empowering. Daniel gave Michael a homemade bracelet made from threads he'd begged from the workshop. It was simple, but it had a special pattern that Daniel had made up himself, 2 intertwined lines that symbolized their bond. Michael wore it under his shirt sleeve, where no one could see it. In return, the pastor gave Daniel his pocket prayer book in a worn leather cover. "Not for prayers," he smiled. "Just to have something of mine always with you." But their happiness couldn't last forever. Gradually, Daniel began to notice that they were being watched, especially one of the guards, a short man named Garza with cold eyes and an unnaturally straight posture. "He's watching us," Daniel said to Michael one night as they lay on the chapel floor, wrapped in the only blanket they had. "Garza." I noticed the looks in his eyes. "I know," Michael sighed. "He checks the chapel when I'm not here. He asks the other inmates about our conversations. Do you think he has a clue? Maybe. There's something about him, unsettling, like a personal hatred." They began to meet less often and be more careful, but the passion between them only grew with the forced separations. Each meeting became more intense, each touch more precious. 2 weeks later, they almost got caught. They were together in the pantry, having lost track of time in each other's arms when the door suddenly opened. Daniel barely had time to grab his shirt and jump aside, and Michael had his back turned to the door, pretending to look for something on the top shelf. "I'm sorry, Pastor." It was Garza, and his voice sounded strained with poorly concealed disgust. "I didn't realize you were here. and with company. Mr. Reyes is helping me with inventory, Michael replied calmly, not turning around. Anything urgent? No, sir. Garza looked around the storeroom slowly, his gaze lingering on the scattered items and Daniel's disheveled hair. Something dark, almost painful, flashed in his eyes. Just checking the rooms. When the door closed, they looked at each other anxiously. Did you see the look in his eyes? Daniel whispered. He looked like he wanted to kill us, Michael finished quietly. There was something personal about it, Daniel. It wasn't just judgmental. What do you mean? I don't know, Michael began, hurriedly buttoning his shirt. But I've heard stories about people like that. People who hate things in others that they can't accept in themselves. Daniel nodded understandingly. He'd met people like that before. People who were particularly cruel to those who reflected their own repressed fears and desires. Garza had stopped Daniel in the hallway one day on his way back from chapel. Spending a lot of time with the pastor, Reyes, he said with a nasty grin. So into religion? He's been helping me work through some things, Daniel said quietly. I'm sure he is. Garza's eyes narrowed, and he could see the fury in them. People like you always find a way to twist everything, even religion. I don't know what you mean. Daniel met his gaze firmly, not averting his eyes. Garza took a step closer, his voice quieter but with steel in it. My father taught me what to do with men like you. Taught me very clear. Daniel saw something in his eyes that made him shudder inwardly, a dark mixture of hatred, disgust, and something else that looked like pain. For a moment, it seemed to him that those eyes were a reflection of his own feelings, distorted by a crooked mirror. Careful, Reyes, Garza added, backing away. It's easy for accidents to happen within these walls. Accidents. Daniel told Michael about the conversation, and he turned pale. This isn't just animosity, he said, rubbing his neck nervously. It's bigotry. Dangerous bigotry. I'm afraid he might do something irreparable. What are we going to do? Daniel asked, feeling fear and anxiety clench his heart. Maybe I should talk to the principal, Michael said thoughtfully. Not about us, of course, but about Garza's behavior, about his threats. It's unacceptable for a security guard. No, Daniel shook his head. It would only provoke him. People like him become more dangerous when they feel threatened. Then what? Just wait for him to do something scary? We have to be more careful. Daniel took Michael's hands in his. Maybe stop seeing each other for a while. Let it subside. Michael nodded, but Daniel could see the doubt in his eyes. I'll try to talk to him, the pastor said after a pause. Not directly about his suspicions, but just as a pastor. Maybe I can get through to him. It's dangerous. Daniel squeezed his hands tighter. I've seen people like that. You can't change their mind with words. I have to try, Michael said softly. It's my job to try to reach even the most misguided souls. And besides, he smiled sadly, I can't just give up on our meetings. They've become too important to me. Their last meeting took place 3 days after this conversation. Michael arrived at the chapel late in the afternoon, when Daniel already thought he wasn't coming. The pastor looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. What's wrong? Daniel asked, hugging him. I talked to Garza today, Michael answered quietly, hugging Daniel back tightly. I invited him into my office under the pretext of discussing the rehabilitation program. How was it? Terrible, Michael shook his head. I'd never seen so much hatred in a man's eyes. I tried to talk about compassion, about each of us struggling with our own demons, but he started screaming. He said horrible things about his father, how he was teaching him to be a real man. Did he threaten you? Daniel asked tensely. Not directly, but there was so much anger in his words, Michael sighed. I think he's not just suspicious. He knows about us, and it drives him crazy because it touches something deeply personal. I'm afraid for you, Daniel whispered, snuggling against Michael. People like that are unpredictable. I'm more afraid for you, Michael replied. You're a prisoner. You have no protection. I think I should ask for a transfer. If I go, he'll leave you alone. No! Daniel grabbed him by the shoulders. I can't lose you. We'll find another way out. I don't know if there is, Michael said sadly. But I don't want to leave you. Not now. Not when I've finally realized what it means to be truly alive." They talked for a long time that night, weighing their options, searching for a solution. In the end, Michael decided that he would try to talk to the prison director again, not about his relationship with Daniel, but about Garza's disturbing behavior, his instability. "I love you," Michael said as he said goodbye. "Whatever happens, remember that." "And I you," Daniel replied, kissing him one last time. "We'll get through this, together." He didn't know then that that kiss would be their last, that 2 days later the prison would be rocked by the news of Pastor Parker's death, found with his throat slit in his office after a night of rioting in Cell Block D, and that Garza would be the one to be the first to discover the body. Daniel awoke to an unfamiliar noise. In 2 months in prison, he'd grown accustomed to certain sounds, the clanking of doors at 6 in the morning, the hum of voices in the mess hall, the metallic clanking of bars. But this noise was different, disturbing, rising like a wave of panic. "What's going on?" he asked Ramon, who was already standing at the cell door listening. "Something happened in Cell Block D last night," the cellmate replied. "They say there was a riot, and someone was dead." Daniel's heart clenched. He knew that Michael sometimes spent late hours in the chapel, preparing for sermons or just enjoying the rare moments of silence. "No," he thought, "not him." "Who died?" Daniel asked, trying to speak calmly, though he felt cold inside. "I don't know exactly," Ramon shrugged, "but there's a lot of security, and the police are here." The day hadn't started on schedule. They weren't allowed to eat breakfast. The food was brought directly to the cells. The guards were tense, avoided eye contact, gave one-word answers. It wasn't until lunchtime that a rumor spread that made Daniel feel the floor drop away from under his feet. "It's the pastor," said a prisoner from the next cell as they were led out into the courtyard. "Parker was murdered. Found him in the restroom outside the chapel. Drowned in the toilet, you know? Someone held him down until he drowned." Daniel froze, unable to believe what he was hearing. His ears rang and his eyes went black. He clutched at the mesh fence to keep from falling. "Hey, what are you doing?" he heard as if through absorbent cotton. "Are you sick?" Daniel shook his head, unable to say a word. Something inside him shattered, leaving his heart an empty void filled with pain. "Is it true?" He struggled when he could speak. "About the parson?" "Yes," the prisoner nodded. "Garza found him. They say someone from D Block snuck in during the riots and killed him. Like for revenge or something. Garza." The name echoed in Daniel's chest with a new flash of pain. He remembered his last conversation with Michael, his anxiety, his decision to talk to the principal about the guard's strange behavior. "I love you. Whatever happens, remember that." Michael's last words sounded like a goodbye now, as if he had a premonition of what was to come. Daniel didn't remember surviving that day. He moved on autopilot, did as he was told, answered when asked, but inside he was dead, lost, devastated, crushed by the unbearable weight of grief he couldn't even show. For no one knew that the pastor was not just a spiritual advisor to him, but a lover, the center of his world within those gray walls. That evening, when they were locked in their cells, Daniel finally let the tears flow. He lay on the top bunk, turned away from the wall, sobbing silently into his pillow. Ramon tactfully pretended not to notice, though he must have heard the muffled sobs. The next morning, the police arrived at the prison. Not regular officers, but homicide detectives. The prisoners were called in for questioning one by one, especially those who had frequent contact with the pastor. "Reyes out," the guard said as he opened the cell door after lunch. "To see the detective." Daniel nodded, trying to look calm. He knew he'd be called in sooner or later. He was one of those who spent a lot of time with the pastor. The detective was waiting in the interview room, a short woman in her early 40s with attentive eyes and short-cropped brown hair. When Daniel entered, she looked at him studiedly. "I'm Detective Lauren Clark," she introduced herself. "Have a seat, Mr. Reyes." Daniel sat down across from her, trying not to show his excitement. "I understand you've been in frequent contact with Pastor Parker," she began without preamble. "Yes," Daniel replied calmly. "He's been helping me adjust. We talked about books, about philosophy. He was a good man." When was the last time you saw him? Daniel thought for a moment. The truth was too dangerous, too intimate. Their last meeting, their last kiss, their last words of love. It was only theirs, and he couldn't share it with the detective. 3 days ago, he said instead, at the chapel service. We spoke briefly afterward. And what was the conversation about? About the book he gave me. Daniel pointed to the pocket prayer book he'd brought with him. Said it might be of interest to me. Detective Clark glanced at the book but didn't pick it up. Mr. Reyes, are you aware that Pastor Parker was killed in a particularly brutal way? He heard rumors. Daniel felt nausea rising in his throat at the thought of what had been done to Michael. They drowned him in the toilet, she said, watching his reaction carefully. Kept his head underwater until he suffocated. It's not just a murder, it's an execution, with elements of humiliation. Daniel clenched his fists under the table so as not to give away the trembling in his hands. Why are you telling me this? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Because it's not like random violence during a prison riot, she replied. This is personal. And I want to know if someone had a personal motive to kill Pastor Parker. I don't have an answer, Daniel said honestly. Everyone I know respected him. He was different, not like most prison chaplains. Different? What do you mean? He saw us as people, not just prisoners. Daniel spoke from the heart now, letting the sincere pain seep into the words. He didn't judge, didn't lecture. He just listened, helped. That's rare around here. Detective Clark looked at him appraisingly, like she was trying to see beneath the mask. Some of the inmates say you were especially close to the pastor, she said. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. We got along well, he admitted cautiously. We had common interests. Literature, philosophy. That's it? What else is there supposed to be? Daniel met her gaze, trying to look perplexed. Detective Clark didn't answer directly, instead asking, Where were you the night of the murder? In my cell, Daniel answered. Just like everyone else in C Block. We didn't have a disturbance. Can anyone confirm that? My cellmate, Ramon Martinez, and the guards who made their rounds. She wrote down a name and nodded. Did you notice anything unusual about the pastor's behavior lately? Has he been troubled? Scared? Daniel hesitated. It was a dangerous question. Michael was troubled indeed because of Garza, because of his threats and hatred. But telling him about it meant getting closer to revealing their relationship. He's been a little broody lately, Daniel finally said, deciding to share some of the truth, like something was bothering him. But he wouldn't say what it was. Do you have any guesses? No, Daniel lied, hating himself for it. But he wasn't ready to point to Garza without proof yet. It would be too dangerous. Detective Clark studied him for a few more seconds, then nodded. Thank you for your time, Mr. Reyes. If you think of anything else that might be helpful, let me know. When Daniel returned to his cell, he was shivering. The interrogation had squeezed him emotionally. He felt devastated and guilty at the same time. Guilty for hiding the truth, for not protecting Michael's memory, for not pointing out his likely killer. But he knew that without proof, his words were worthless. More than that, they could jeopardize his own. If Garza found out he suspected him, what would happen? The same toilet bowl? In the days that followed, Daniel began his own investigation. Carefully, discreetly, he watched Garza. His behavior, his conversations with the other guards, his interactions with the prisoners. He noticed that Garza had become more twitchy. He had been characterized by a certain nervousness before, but now it had increased. He snapped at the prisoners without cause, checking the chapel often, as if he were looking for something or someone. And Daniel was sure he was watching him, watching his every move. Through the other prisoners, Daniel began to gather information about Garza. Turns out the guard had worked at Riverside for about 5 years. Before that, he'd been in the army, but he'd quit. Didn't know much about his personal life. Unsociable, lives alone, never talks about his family. Only once did I hear him mention his father, said one of the prisoners who worked in the administration building. He was talking to someone on the phone. Something like, "My father was right to whip him with a belt. He grew up to be a man." This information confirmed what Michael had said about his last conversation with Garza, about how he'd yelled about his father, about his lessons. Detective Clark was continuing her investigation as well. Daniel saw her interviewing other inmates, staff, studying surveillance tapes. Once he noticed her talking to Garza, tensely, with some hidden challenge. The breakthrough came a week after the murder. Daniel was working in the laundry room, sorting laundry, when he overheard two inmates from housekeeping talking. "They recently changed that toilet bowl thing, the one that colors the water," one said. "Only in the administration building, on the first floor, have they replaced it yet. It's still old everywhere else." "And what, does it color much?" asked the second. "Very much. Blue as ink. Johnson cleaned my sleeve when he cleaned it. I had to give him a new shirt because this one wouldn't wash." Daniel froze, listening. The restroom near the chapel was in the administration building on the first floor. If that was where this new chemistry was. He looked at the pile of uniforms that had just been brought in for washing. Among them were the guards' uniforms, long-sleeved gray shirts. After looking around and making sure no one was watching, Daniel started going through the clothes, looking for irregular stains. And he found some. There were blue stains on the cuffs and bottom of the sleeves of one of the shirts, barely visible but different from normal dirt. He checked the tag on the collar. Garza Vi, Vincent Garza. It was evidence. Perhaps not conclusive to a court of law, but enough to steer the investigation in the right direction. If Garza had indeed drowned Michael in the toilet holding his head, his sleeves would inevitably come into contact with the chemical-stained water. Now Daniel had to find a way to get this information to the detective without giving himself away. The solution came unexpectedly. One of the prisoners, Eddie, worked as an assistant in the office where the interrogations were conducted. He could pass the note. "I need a favor," Daniel told Eddie the next day. A note for Detective Clark to pass along, anonymously. "Snitching?" Eddie squinted. "I didn't expect you to." "It's about the pastor," Daniel said quietly. "He was a good man, deserves justice." Eddie looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Give me the note. I won't say who it's from." Daniel wrote a short message. "Check Garza's uniform for blue stains from toilet bowl chemicals. The restroom where the pastor was killed is using a new cleaner with blue dye. Only in the administration building, first floor. Nowhere else." That same day, Detective Clark returned to the prison and requested a chemical analysis of all of the guards' recently laundered uniforms, as well as a records check on the prison's replacement cleaning products. 2 days later, word spread through the prison. Garza had been taken away in handcuffs. They found traces of the same chemical used in the restroom where the pastor was killed on his uniform, and surveillance cameras showed that he had been in the administration building the night of the murder, even though he was scheduled to be in another cell block. Daniel felt a strange desolation. Not joy, not contentment, just a quiet, bitter certainty that this wasn't over. Michael wasn't coming back anyway, no matter what happened to his killer. That evening, he was called back to Detective Clark's office. "We've arrested Officer Garza," she said without preamble. "We found evidence linking him to Pastor Parker's murder. Chemicals on his uniform, inconsistencies in his statements about his whereabouts the night of the murder." Daniel nodded silently, not knowing what to say. "But I think you already knew it was him," she continued, watching his reaction carefully. "And I think you know why he did it." "I don't know what you mean," Daniel replied cautiously. "Mr. Reyes," Detective Clark leaned closer, "I'm not judging you, and I'm not going to get you in trouble. I just want to understand what happened, why Garza killed Pastor Parker." Daniel stared at her, trying to decide if he could trust her. He'd kept their secret for so long, so afraid of the consequences of revealing it. "There was a special relationship between you and the pastor, wasn't there?" she asked softly. "More than just friendship or spiritual guidance." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the last vestiges of his defenses crumble. "Yes," he whispered. "We loved each other." Detective Clark nodded, as if she'd heard confirmation of her theory. "And Garza knew about it?" "He suspected it. Maybe he saw something." Michael, Pastor Parker, said that Garza was very aggressive when he talked to him, yelling about how his father taught him to hate people like us. "Like us?" "Gays." Daniel said the word with defiance, with pride. Michael thought Garza was struggling with it himself, that his hatred of us was a hatred of himself. Detective Clark nodded thoughtfully. "Garza confessed," she said after a pause. "After we showed him the results of his uniform analysis and the camera footage. But you know what the weirdest thing is? He didn't express remorse. He said he did what he had to do, that his father would be proud of him. Daniel felt nausea coming up his throat. He described the murder in detail, Clark continued, though Daniel wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. How he'd stalked the pastor outside the chapel, how he dragged him into the bathroom, how he'd held his head in the toilet until he stopped resisting. Said, "Men like him deserve to die in the dirt." Daniel clenched his fists, feeling rage and pain overwhelm him. It wasn't an impulse, the detective said. He'd been planning it, waited for the right moment. The prison riots gave him the perfect cover. "I should have protected him," Daniel whispered, feeling tears sting his eyes. "I should have realized sooner that Garza was capable of this." "You couldn't have known," Clark objected softly. "And you helped catch him. Thanks to you, he'll answer for his crime." Daniel nodded, but there was no comfort in that. Michael was dead anyway, his life, full of love and compassion, cut short in a filthy prison toilet at the hand of a man blinded by hate. "What happens now?" he asked. "To me, to our story?" "Officially, Pastor Parker was victimized by a guard who was inappropriately violent out of personal animosity," Detective Clark said. "The details of your relationship will not be mentioned in the reports. It's not relevant to the investigation." "Thank you," Daniel said quietly. "Don't thank me," she shook her head. "I'm just doing my job, and part of that job is to protect the dignity of the victims." After the detective left, Daniel was taken back to his cell. He felt devastated, drained. Justice had been served, Garza had been arrested, the truth had been revealed, but that didn't make it any easier. The next evening, when the first wave of rumors and noise had subsided, Daniel asked permission to visit the chapel. The new guard who'd replaced Garza looked at him in surprise, but nodded. 15 minutes. The chapel was empty and quiet. The sun was setting, its rays coloring the stained glass window with reds and golds. Daniel sat in the pew in the last row, the one where he'd first spoken to Michael. He pulled out the pocket prayer book Michael had given him, the worn leather cover, the pages yellowed with time. An ordinary book, for others, a priceless treasure for him. Daniel ran his fingers over the pages, lingering on the places where Michael had once left bookmarks. This book had seen his hands, his eyes, was part of his daily ritual, long before they met. In the silence of the chapel, Daniel felt a strange clarity. Not relief. The pain stayed with him, but not devastation either. The killer had been caught. Justice had been served. But Michael is dead, and nothing will change that. Strange. Now, sitting in the empty chapel, he felt Michael's presence more strongly than in any other place in the prison. Maybe something of his spirit remained within these walls that had absorbed so much prayer and hope. His faith. "To love is to be vulnerable," Michael had said in one of their last meetings. Daniel only now realized the depth of those words, vulnerable to pain, to loss, to memory. Light fell through the stained glass window, playing with the colors on the wooden benches. Soon it will be dark. A day is ending, and another will begin. Time does not stop, not even for grief. When the guard returned, Daniel was ready to leave. He carefully tucked the prayer book into an inside pocket. "Ready?" the guard asked. "Yes." As he left the chapel, he didn't look back. There was no need. What mattered, he took with him.